all right, picture this. You've just stepped off a long haul flight and you're pretty tired. At this stage, you're just a little bit like, get me out of the airport. I'm so over this. And so you're forced to weave your way through duty-free, through all the aisles of temptation. If you're anything like me, I really like giant Toblerone, so I sort of stand there for a little while looking at them. But then you turn the corner and you see this. Cool. You're confused. But you're not the only one that's confused. Everybody else around you, they're also confused. And because of that, it is not a good time. It is not a good time for you, and it's not a good time for all the screaming babies all around you and their families, and it's not a good time for the staff that are working in that area. And that was the problem that we were trying to solve. So the problem that we were trying to solve was that incoming international passengers were confused after duty-free about what they were supposed to do next. And what that resulted in was bottlenecks of people. It resulted in actually people picking the wrong path, and it actually meant that customs officers, some of them actually had to leave their stations and shepherd people into the correct lanes. And ultimately, it meant that people were slower in crossing the border. And the problem that we were trying to solve meant that we had to have a really good understanding of the human experience of interacting with a physical space. So that's where virtual reality comes in. So we used VR to simulate different designs in different environments to understand what could make that experience better. And I'm going to cut straight to the chase and say I think virtual reality is a bit of a game changer when it comes to UX and user research. And the first reason why is that it offers really minimal disruption to the physical space that you're trying to test. So this is the airport. Doesn't look that busy, not too bad at this stage. And like a lot of projects that we do, we kicked off with a bit of a discovery, which meant immersing ourselves in that space a little bit, talking to staff and just generally observing passenger flow. We also thought that it would be appropriate to baseline the existing human experience by conducting some intercept interviews. Surprise, surprise, these people don't really want to do an intercept interview with you. And so what virtual reality allows us to do is that it allows us to test sort of different design hypotheses and assumptions without actually interfering with the operations of that space. And that's quite powerful. The second thing is that it allows us to create an immersive representation of that space, and it's actually a really adaptive medium. It's super customizable. So for us, we were interested in the variables of wayfinding, and we were interested in layout design. And so for us, you can see the airport. I've completely ruined that shot. Sorry, that's my silhouette. But that's the airport, and that's what the VR environment was like for us. That for us was actually sufficient. That was an awesome representation of the space for what we were trying to test. But VR is really adaptable. So if we were testing the variables of, say, passengers moving in and out of the space and the impact of that, that might be more of a development effort, but that can be done in VR. If, for example, you were only interested in the impact of another 10 smart gates coming into that space, you might not even need that level of detail. So it's a really, really great medium to do this sort of work. And the third one is probably like the best, and it's a question that I love to ask, because I can ask the question of, if you could have the space your way, how would you design that space? So what VR allows us to do is that it allows us to do virtual co-design with our participants live. And so it means you no longer have that ambiguity of, they kind of wanted the sign larger or higher or brighter. You can actually just do it with them while they're there, and then you can get them to relive that space and just make those tweaks. And the best thing is you can save that environment and then relive Bob's design time and time again and use that as sort of an artifact. It's really powerful, and here's an example of kind of how it works. So let's just say I wanted to move or place a gate in a very conveniently gape-sized hole. But you can see it just sort of takes like a matter of seconds. And you can do that with signage, and you can do that with furniture and objects. And yeah, it's a very powerful medium to do co-design in. So there are plenty of applications where this whole VR UX thing works quite nicely in. And the first is for really difficult to access locations. So the airport's a really good example. Something else that could be great would be restricted areas of perhaps like hospitals or security areas. The second thing that VR and UX work really, really great for is for the rapid experimentation of environments. So even if we had all the money in the world to make a mock airport up and to place signs and furnitures where we thought would be appropriate and then take users through it, to reconfigure that design is a really costly exercise. VR, we can just load up another environment with another design and it takes about 2 seconds to do. The third thing is, I think, quite obvious, but it's before committing to anything, creating anything physical. So it's very similar to the reasons why we prototype. The whole try before you build and try before you code, that sort of thing is like try before you actually create anything physical. And that can be from something as small as a piece of jewelry, like Amelia showed me earlier today, her VR, that's really awesome, to something really, really massive, like say I was going to build a house in Switzerland and I wanted to see what it was like, for example. And the last thing is where conventional methods may not be appropriate. So more and more in the industry, we're starting to see VR being used for situations that aren't really practical or realistic to recreate or repeat in real life. So we're starting to see more emergency situations being created in VR, for example. And when you do that, that becomes quite interesting because it is repeatable and you can kind of assess how people react and adapt to those situations. And so lots of training applications coming up through different industries as well. But of course, we learnt a lot of things along the way, and I don't think we've quite nailed it yet. And the first one is when you do VR and UX together, there is a massive initial cognitive load. So our last cycle of research, we had 50% of people had never ever used virtual reality before. And of the other 50% that had, most of them had sort of just used it recreationally, or I tried it once when I was at Te Papa with the Air New Zealand exhibition. So it's not ubiquitous. It is not a ubiquitous technology. And when you give people, some controllers and a headset, and then you're like, hey, can you please learn this technology? And then give me heaps of feedback, within half an hour. Not really realistic. It is actually quite hard. And so things that we've had to accommodate for, we've had to actually we just let them have a really neutral play space in VR. So when you hand off the controllers and the headset to someone, the first 5 to 10 minutes, they just sort of learn how to maneuver, they learn how to teleport, they get used to that sense of control, they get used to that environment. And the other thing that's really important to account for that we weren't so good at the start is extra time. For some people, it takes maybe 5 seconds to get used to VR, and for other people, it takes up to 15 minutes. And so if you've kind of planned for a 1 hour session, 15 minutes is actually a significant amount of time that you've got to account for. Cool. The second thing that is quite different to a typical user research session is the fact that you get really up close and personal with your participant. And so typically when you do UX research, you sort of sit next to a person, maybe with a laptop with a very respectable amount of personal space between you and your participant. With VR, you get comments like, this feels really weird, the goggles are really tight, my vision is all blurry. And then that you sort of quickly have to jump into troubleshooting mode as a team. And very quickly, you need to make adjustments to somebody's headset. And that's all up in this space. It's quite a personal space. I don't know. I don't really like strangers kind of coming this close to me. And it's something that we've definitely had to think a lot about. And so some additional considerations that we've had to make is the whole, we've got to establish and build that trust yet, the maximum awareness. And what I mean by that is being absolutely explicit that you're about to physically touch somebody, because they are actually blind to you. They have no idea you're coming in to fix a strap. That actually means that you're touching their hair and that space there. So, hey, Eric, I am going to adjust the headset now. Do you mind? Are you okay with that? This should make everything better. Obviously stressing the fact that it is voluntary participation, that people can pull out at any point that they want to. And the last one that we haven't quite nailed yet is the cultural consideration. So in some cultures, this sort of level of contact with a stranger isn't entirely appropriate. And we sort of do have questions amongst ourselves as to, will people self-opt out of this sort of research because of this? What if it happens during a session? I guess, all sorts of things that I think we need to be thinking about, and is it something that we have to be explicit with up front before we even recruit? So things to think about. The setup for user research in VR is really different to a typical session. So if we think about our three players, the user, the facilitator, and the note taker. As a facilitator, the first question you ask yourself is, where should I stand? So you might have just gotten the user all set up. You're like, here you are, just stand next to them. They're all nice and comfortable. They're ready to go. And you're like, cool. And then they start moving. And then all of a sudden, you realize you're very, very quickly, you're within striking range of your user and their swinging arms. And so you might back off a little bit, which is great. But then all of a sudden, you've gone, the note taker's just like, what the heck? I can't see a thing, I can't see the user, I can't see the screens, I don't know what's going on. And so you're like, okay, I just might move again. And then the next question you ask yourself is, well, hold on a sec, I've figured out where I should stand. Where should I look? Do I look at the user? Do I look at the screen? Do I look at what the user's doing in real life, or do I look at what they're doing in VR? And so I guess as a facilitator, the one thing you must do, is you always have to keep an eye on the screen, because that's the only way you can figure out where they are in that virtual space. But the other thing you've got to do is also consider your relative position to the user. And so what I mean by that is if you stand front on to a person that's going through a VR experience, you have the best chance of understanding emotion and body language. I will say that a headset completely obstructs this half of your face. That is a very expressive half of your face, but you do have the best chance at it. But what you kind of screw up for yourself is the frame of reference. So what I mean by that is you're always looking at the screen. In the screen, they're moving forward, but if you're facing them, they're moving towards you. So you've got to compensate for that motion in your head. If you stand behind them, you lose emotion and you lose body language, but it feels a little bit more like you're in their shoes. So if they're moving forward, you can kind of get that sense as well, because you're in line with a screen. And if you're sort of standing side on, it's kind of average for all the things, I guess. But of course, so you've got so much to think about as a facilitator, and then the minute you think you've got it figured all out, they're basically walking into a wall anyway. So you've got to quickly just adapt to that and be like, oh my God, and figure that one out. So the note taker has really similar sort of issues, I guess. The first one is, well, what do I make notes of, right? Do I make notes of what the user's doing in real life? Do I make notes of what they're doing in VR? Do I make notes of what's happening on screen? Do I make notes of verbatim? And then also, where do I look as well? I don't have the answers to everything. It's very, very new to us. But I can share with you some of the things that have helped us along the way. And the first one is mobility is key. So facilitators always up on their feet, thinking on their feet and physically on your feet, always moving around in the space. It's very, very tiring. A note taker, we have our note taker use Optimal's reframer, hello. And so they are seated using their laptop. But the thing for us, for the note taker, the thing that's really important is the wheelie chair, ridiculously important. To swivel around, to be able to spin around, to be able to move it, around the space. Super, super important. And we've had note takers kind of physically move up and over as well. Mapping spaces becomes incredibly important. So what I mean by that is you've got to map your virtual space to your physical space. And so in VR, I guess, inevitably, if you're testing some sort of variable, if you're testing some sort of hypotheses, for us it was signage. So there's always like a direction where people would turn and they'd have the most to say. When they turn and have the most to say about that particular thing, you don't want them to be facing the back wall. You want them to be facing outwards so that everybody in the team has the best chance of succeeding and hearing and adapting to that. So that's all about adjusting your senses and adjusting sort of the boundaries of where you're working. Heat maps become really important to us. So heat maps help us to, it sort of shows where people have spent the most amount of time looking. You can see here in this particular scenario, this is a lot of people that we've just overlaid on top of each other. It's actually, interesting because you can see all the signage is sort of drawing the most amount of attention. And along with heat maps, path tracking also becomes really important to us as well. And so you can see here a lot of people. Yeah, for me, I'll just talk about the most interesting thing for me on this path. Like, for me, this bit here is really, really interesting for this particular layout of the airport. So there was a sign with, let's just say, not very clear content that was about here. And it was also hard to read. So people would come around, this was duty free, they'd come around, they'd go here, and they'd be like, if they knew where they were going, they'd just go. But you can kind of see that there are a few people that came down here. They were like, I don't get it, I walked away. So when you get path tracking and heat mapping, and also you've got your notes that you've captured as well, you sort of start to get a really multi-dimensional view of what happened in that session. So it helps with the fact that you might have missed some stuff because so many things are happening along the way. Cool. And the unintentional bonus, this is kind of fun, is the fact that, sometimes when you do user research, you get the occasional mumbler, they just mumble to themselves. In VR, it's really awesome because the note takers all of a sudden like, hey, I can't hear them. And they can actually physically wave their hands and be like, I can't hear them at all. And then your facilitator can all of a sudden just ask a nice clarifying question, and everybody wins. Biases are really interesting because we have all the conventional biases of user research. Confirmation bias is still very real, recency effect is still very real, but there are two that are made, I think, more complex by the fact that VR has been introduced. So the first is the whole novelty factor thing. So a lot of comments that we get at the end are, hey, it was so cool, what a wonderful experience. What do you mean? Do you mean VR was a wonderful experience? Or do you mean that scenario and that layout and that cool design that we placed in front of you, was that the wonderful experience? Or in your head, is that one and the same? And that kind of makes things quite complicated and actually kind of interesting. The second thing that seems to be made a hell of a lot worse is the observer effect. So some of the comments that we get are, hey, was that good enough? I've never ever done this before. And I think it's the fact that people do almost get a sense of performance anxiety when you give them technology that they're unfamiliar with. So you give them a headset, you give them controllers. They are vulnerable, they're blind to the world, but there are people watching them. And it just seems to make everything just that little bit, I think, a little bit worse. So that's quite interesting to observe. Sickness is, probably the one big difference to a typical user research session. Some of the symptoms that we've seen, people being visibly distressed, some heavy breathing, and people feeling nauseous. I will say, though, that the airport example, people weren't feeling very nauseous. It was done using the HTC Vive. It was actually a really good, great experience with awesome frame rate. But we have done a sort of training app for a company before on Google Cardboard where nausea was 100% a result of some of our research. And so some of the things that we have made considerations for, some personal judgment, being, just being professional about it, but actually just being ready to pull the plug on your session. If someone's ill, just game over. Frame rate's really important. I think the magic number is 90 frames per second. Seems to be seems to not make people feel ill. Obviously stressing the fact that it is voluntary withdrawal as well, so if people aren't comfortable, they can leave at any point in time. And we've got a sick bag. We've never had to use it before, thankfully, but we do have one just in case. It's new to us. I'm not going to sort of stand here and pretend that I'm an expert on this. So we've got a whole lot of unknowns as well. So the first question, I guess, is the whole, like, how real is too real sort of thing. And so when you're doing VR user research, you are literally replacing somebody's world, even if it's temporary. And it means that you influence the way that they perceive that world. And I feel that with great power comes great responsibility. So we don't ever feel good about making people feel good. I hope nobody does. And so the whole ethics of making people feel a certain way, like I'll just talk about the example, the Google Cardboard application we tested for a client. We had a user come back to us a day later and he said, 2 hours later I was at dinner and I still felt like my whole world, I felt like I was on a boat. And we were like, oh my God, okay, that's not good. And so what we've done is we maybe overkilled it, I think, last time, but we gave people scenarios for the airport, even though we knew that it was a really, really great experience for us. Like, we didn't really feel kind of yuck, but we made sure that after every single scenario, after every 2 minutes, we'd give them the next, like they'd take off their headset, we'd ask if they were okay, we'd give them the next scenario in real life, and then get them going again. And so it didn't mean that we had to take it on and off and on and off and on and off, but for us it gave us that comfort that, we were doing the best by our participants. Same with our team as well. So in some of these environments, we do have to spend a bit of time setting things up. So we have to be immersed in VR ourselves. So about making sure that nobody's spending 6 hours of their 8-hour working day in VR just because they find it fun, but we don't want them to kind of leave feeling yuck and actually impacting maybe their physical safety as well. This is a very hypothetical question that we've got for ourselves, but what would it be like if we were also immersed in the VR environment as a virtual user research team? So this kind of came about because this is kind of what we see when they're in the environment. So we see that's flattened, that doesn't get all the peripheral sort of stuff, right? So we don't really get to feel what it's like. We can only sort of perceive it from the outside world. And so, but it raises a whole bunch more questions, right? Like if I was a virtual facilitator, what does that even mean? Like, is it worse to have a disembodied voice talking to you from outside the VR environment or from within it, or does it actually make no difference at all? Would a virtual facilitator avatar ruin your immersion? Quite possibly. And how would a virtual facilitator read the human experience anyway if they can't see the real person? I don't know. We just spend a long time debating this amongst the team. And how do we stop it all feeling like one giant video game? So this is, again, another really common comment that we get. No, you can't win an airport scenario. Like, there's no such thing. So I don't know. It's probably because the virtual reality, it's not ubiquitous. Like, not everybody knows it yet, but for some reason, when you give someone 2 controllers and a headset, they feel like they're in a game. They feel like they have to better their last scenario. They feel like they have to race through it. Even when you stress that the purpose of today is for you to give us feedback on this physical environment around you, people still feel like, oh yes, like I just need to go through it as fast as I can and just go, I don't have the answer to that question at all, but it's certainly an interesting observation to have made. So some final thoughts. Virtual reality is a really, really powerful tool for user research, but the immersive aspect of it, I think, brings focus to our responsibility as researchers to keep people psychologically, emotionally, and physically safe. But it's new technology, and there's so much to learn, and I feel like we're only at the start. I feel like this is where things get really, really exciting, and I'm very, very excited to see where it goes. Thanks.